Greetings. Welcome to today's lesson on planetary friendships, enemies, and Mulatrikona. My name is Dustin Cormier, and I'm with Asheville Vedic Astrology. You can also find me on my own YouTube channel called How to Rock Astrology. If you like what you learn in this video, consider taking the self-paced Astrological apprenticeship program with Asheville Vedic Astrology. Click the link in the bottom of the description box below to see what that's all about. Today is a video that I've been wanting to do for Asheville Vedic Astrology for some time because I've always known and been fascinated by how important the Mulatrikonas are in defining much of what we use in Vedic Jyotish and Vedic astrology. One of the most important concepts in Jyotish, Vedic astrology, that sets it apart from other astrological systems like Western, Hellenistic, and what have you, is the friendships versus enemies system between planets. You know, the sun is friends with Mars and Jupiter and the moon. And there are also enemies between planets. And sometimes one planet can be an enemy to another planet, and that same planet is a friend to the other planet. This system is key in understanding the dignity of planets and signs, as well as the Lagitati of Ashtas, which Ernst Wilhelm gives huge importance to, and it's of course very important in Asheville as well. And this system of friends and enemies gives clues as to whether a planet might act auspiciously or inauspiciously towards the Lagna, the rising sign. I'm just going to check that we can see here. Good. So we have friendly grahas, enemy grahas, and neutral grahas. Of course, a graha means planet for those who are just getting into Jyotish. Now, you may have noticed, this is a little caveat that I like to give here. Jyotish astrologers tend to be more liberal in how they label things as good or bad in astrology. There's auspicious things and there are inauspicious things. And this system of friendship and enemies is one of the main instigators of this idea that we can have a difficult planet in astrology, and there are difficulties that we have to attend to with certain planets. But don't forget that Jyotishis see even the harshest karmas as just that. It's a karma. It's a past action neuromemory, a samskara witnessed by the eternal clear Atman within. This is sort of prepping you for being a counselor, an understanding that we are not necessarily fixed to our karmas, although they are a part of this incarnation. The Atman within, the witness of these memory karmas. The Atman sees and knows itself to be detached from these karmas, ultimately. If we want to liberate ourselves from the karmas of an ill planet or an inauspicious planet, or any placement in our chart or in a client's chart, we must act in accord with a transcendental understanding of what the meaning of that karma is without attaching to an identity with it. Because nothing is permanently fixed from the transcendental perspective of eternal life. This is just sort of giving an idea of how Vedic people conceive of what we see in an astrology chart. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty of today's session. Mulatrikonas are part of what makes, again, the friendship and enemies, and this relates to dignity. Many of us will probably know dignity from, what's the dignity of a planet in its sign? The dignity of a planet in a sign is it's simply like this. Is this planet in a sign, in a place, in a field, which is conducive to its agenda? This is the question. Any planet in a sign which does relate to that planet's nature or its agenda will find support in its activity. This is good dignity. And it will not be resisted in its action by the laws of nature. Most people, especially even in Western astrology, understand that a planet can be exalted, it can be debilitated, and it can be somewhere in between. That's usually how most people understand it. And so that means that a planet can have a good placement or a bad placement in its sign. So, this is the logic here. Like, think about it this way. A planet in its own sign, we can see how this would help a planet. If you put a Mars, who's like a soldier, it's our logical, rational instincts towards a certain mechanical function. So if you put a hard soldier in a battlefield, if you put Mars in the sign of Aries or Scorpio, then that's a soldier on a battlefield. They'll be successful with relative ease. They will be supported in doing their job. Their agenda is supported by their environment. Put a gardener in a garden. Put Saturn, a gardener, in a garden. Saturn's all about slow infrastructure and building things and letting things grow in their own time through the understanding of material nature. So if you put Saturn in the sign of Capricorn, Aquarius, they will be able to plant things carefully in their own time, and that gardener will do well in that environment. You put a teacher in a classroom, it's the same thing. That planet is in an environment which is conducive to its agenda. Now, an exalted planet is in the best sign it can possibly be in. Everybody knows that. And there are mystical reasons for each of these positions with the exalted planets and the debilitated planets. The debilitation position is the worst sign a planet could be in. So this is just to give more on this example. Imagine if you put a gardener, like Saturn, on a battlefield. It's a gardener who wants to slowly learn to deeply understand the nature of the life of a plant. If you put somebody like that, who's been doing that all their lives, on a battlefield, they're not going to have time to learn the nature of their enemy. They're just going to get mowed down. You know what I mean? Same thing if you put a teacher like Jupiter in a boring work office cubicle. It's Jupiter being debilitated in Capricorn. Or imagine forcing a soldier to think emotionally while on a battlefield. It's the Mars, the soldier, and the sign of Cancer. So these are ill placements. So we want to have the conscious agent of the planet be placed in an environment which is in harmony with that planet's nature or its agenda. So this is where the Mulatrikona is going to start to come in, and this idea of friendship and enemies. What about when a planet is not in its own sign, or exaltation, or its debilitation sign? How do we define if it's in good dignity or not? And this is mostly the case. Each planet only has, usually it owns 2 signs, and it has 1 exaltation and 1 debilitation sign. That leaves 8 signs that are, have some kind of dignity. Now, this is the question. How do we define whether it's good dignity or not? How do we define if Mars in Taurus, for example, is going to do well in that sign? How do we define if the Sun, situated in Capricorn, will do well? This all comes down to the same principle. Is that sign conducive to the nature of the planet's agenda? Is that sign that it's in conducive to the nature of the planet? Now the question is how do we find that out? Should we use our imagination? The answer is no. We should not simply use our imagination or our intuition when trying to provide foundations for our logic in the science of Jyotish and astrology. This is how the Vedic people tend to convey their understanding, is that there's usually a backbone of logic and mathematical logic behind it. One problem with many beginner astrologers is that they don't consider, they can't see the numerological roots and mathematical underpinnings for their understanding of, for example, a planet and a sign, or even a planet and aspect to another planet. There are numerological roots and mathematical underpinnings for the relationships between the planets. And so many astrologers try to use their intuition and their symbolic inference to quantify a planet and its sign. The Vedic people say that intuition is okay so long as it is ultimately grounded in logic. Most things in Jyotish, Vedic astrology, describes things which tend to have some numerical logic behind it. And friendships and enemies is no exception. The dignity of a planet like Mars and Taurus, for example, has a certain logic behind it. And it's not going to just be something that we can intuit symbolically. It's got mathematical reasoning. So in Jyotish, the relationships between planets are not made up. They're based on mathematics. It's the relationships between planets that cause good or bad dignity associated with a planet in a sign or a planet in aspect with each other. So this is, again, Mars in the sign of Taurus, or Mars being conjunct or aspecting Venus, for example. There's a logic, there's a mathematical formula behind the reason why Mars has a certain relationship with Venus and Mars has a certain relationship with the Sun, and one is better than the other. In this case, the Mars and the Sun tend to be friends, and Mars and Venus tend to be neutral to each other. A planet is either friendly, neutral, or enemies with another planet. Now, let's look at friendship. A planet in the sign of a natural friend does better than a planet in the sign of a natural enemy. Let's look at the Sun. This is a little bit of a symbolic inference that we could see here, and we can intuit this. The Sun is a king. The king does well being free to express itself by its own accord through signs like Cancer, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Pisces, and more. I'm just giving examples here. The Sun does not do so well when the king has to be subservient to another person or a system or an infrastructure, such as when the Sun is in the signs of Taurus, Capricorn, and Aquarius. There is an underlying numerical pattern here. There's a reason why, we can use symbolic inference and understand this, but there is an underlying numerical pattern as to why the Sun does better in certain signs than it does in others. We may be inclined to make such inferences because our intuition feels they make sense, but thankfully, again, Vedic astrology bases these ideas on mathematics, based on what is called the Mulatrikona sign. So there is no room for doubt. Now let's get to it. What is the Mulatrikona? Well, how does Jyotish define the relationships between planets? It all has something to do with something called the Mulatrikona. The Sanskrit word mula means root, like a tree root. The word tri, of course, relates, as you might think, to trines, to threes. The word kona means angles. So trikona, yoga people will know that trikona is the triangle posture, trikonasana. So trikona means the three angles that make up 360 degrees. It's 120 times 3. Now, it's hard to explain and convey what exactly is the esoteric significance of the Mulatrikona, of what the word means and what it's conveying here. Suffice to say, all the planets together actually convey the energy field of the zodiac. The sign of Leo is conveyed by the sun. The sign of Gemini and Virgo is being conveyed by Mercury. This planet is the signs, and the signs are the planets. Now, really, all of the planets work together to convey like this parachute that these kids have. The energy inside is the energy of life, the energy that we have coming through us, through the planets, through the other people around us. But each planet upholds the energy field of the zodiac from a root position. So this is why I've got this sort of like a metaphor here. The planets act as dispositors, the ruler of a sign. And these planets acting as dispositors all make up the living energy of the zodiac, but they hold their corner of the parachute from a specific point called the Mulatrikona. And each planet has a Mulatrikona. Each planet has a sign that they hold the parachute from. And, the sun is involved in all of the signs, in a way, if you understand it. Mars is involved in all the signs. It's interacting with all the signs at some level. But each of these planets makes the ripples in the field through this specific source energy point called the Mulatrikona. Again, it's hard to convey. I've tried to make a metaphor for it here. But the Vedic people insist that when you see how the mathematics works out here, you're going to understand where this is coming from. The sign, described as the root source of a planet's energy and nature, and what a planet is all about, is called the Mulatrikona. The nature of the planets, like for example, what exactly is the sun? Well, you need to see what the sun is in relationship to the other planets. And how do we see the relationship of the sun to the other planets? We see it by looking at the angles between these Mulatrikona points. This is a universally unquestioned principle in all branches of Jyotish. It's one of those things we generally accept as handed down from the ancient clairvoyant seers like Parashara. And I like to say, just to prompt, further thinking, it's like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? The Mulatrikona or the planets? It's amazing to me that our galaxy has planets which relate to the zodiac in this cohesive way. This funny little cosmic joke here. Vishnu says it is no coincidence. Every planet that is going to create consciousness is probably going to have a galactic schema similar to our solar system, where there's a Mars that relates to Aries and Scorpio. There's a Venus that relates to Libra and Taurus. There's a Mercury that relates to Gemini and Virgo. It's a fascinating thing to think about, but this is not the place for philosophical speculation. Now, I'm just going to check one more time that we're good here. It looks good. Now, let's review the following table to see where each planet's Mulatrikona is. This is these signs. This is the place on the zodiac where these planets get their root energy and their nature. How do we know the nature of the sun? Is it comes from 0 to 20 degrees of Leo. That's the Mulatrikona. And remember, if a planet falls in that Mulatrikona, then it's considered to be a good dignity. It's actually second strongest, right underneath exaltation, as we're going to talk about. So the sun's Mulatrikona is 0 to 20 degrees of Leo. The moon's Mulatrikona is 4 to 30 degrees of Taurus. 0 to 3 degrees is considered the actual exaltation of the moon. 0 to 3 degrees of Taurus is exaltation, and then 4 to 30 degrees is the Mulatrikona. And it's that place that the moon gets its root nature from in an interesting way. Mars has its Mulatrikona in Aries. Mercury has its Mulatrikona in Virgo. Jupiter has its Mulatrikona in Sagittarius. Venus has its Mulatrikona in Libra. Makes sense. And Saturn's Mulatrikona is Aquarius, interestingly, not Capricorn. The only two planets that have Mulatrikonas in feminine signs are the Moon and Mercury. And we'll talk about how the Moon and Mercury are kind of funny for that reason. They are these sort of fillers of the gaps in a certain way. Now I'm just going to keep moving on here. Many interpreters define the Mulatrikona sign as the second strongest dignity a planet can fall into, next to exaltation, and that's if a planet is in its own Mulatrikona. It's a blessing to have a planet in its own Mulatrikona, and it's considered to be good dignity, has 75% to 87% of its strength by sign. Now remember that strength for the dignity of a planet can be for good or ill. For example, an exalted planet that's inauspicious or ill, or kind of what we call evil, can cause devastation through that strength. Like, for example, the eighth lord, if you have an exalted eighth lord in a sign, it can cause trouble because the eighth house is unstable. Think about Mercury for a Scorpio rising. Mercury owns the evil 8th and 11th houses. There are reasons why we consider these houses to be unstable. The 11th house has the egotism of wanting to attain, and the 8th house is unstable because it desires power in a way, and it is willing to be chaotic. So an exalted Mercury, or a Mercury in its Mulatrikona sign, can be a little too loud for a Scorpio rising. But that sharpness can still be useful and very important. It's still good for that planet. This is just the nature of how Vedic astrology intermixes things. It's just good to be aware of these rules as you go along in your apprenticeship. So how exactly does the Mulatrikona define friendship and enemies between grahas and Jyotish astrology? It has everything to do with where the signs ruled by one planet are positioned from the Mulatrikona of another planet. Now I'm going to clarify this a little bit right here. The natural relationships between planets are all based on the Mulatrikona, the root trine. And this comes from chapter 3, I believe it is verse 55 of Parashara's Brihat Parashara Horashastra. This is where Parashara is laying down the basics, the real underlying firmament of the nature of the planets and the signs. Parashara says, the rulers of a sign, which is the rulers of signs, which are the 2nd, 4th, 5th, 8th, 9th, and 12th, from the Mulatrikona of another planet, are friendly to that planet. So that means that if the ruler of a sign, let's say we're talking about the moon has, if the moon's sign, which is Cancer, is in the 2nd house from another planet's Mulatrikona, then the moon is considered a friend to that planet. If it's in the 4th house from the Mulatrikona, then it's considered a friend. But if Cancer falls into the 3rd house, the 3rd sign from another planet's Mulatrikona, then the moon will be considered an enemy to that planet. Now, the lords of the signs other than these friendly ones are its enemies. But there is an exception, and this is an important exception. We're going to see it when we look at the friends of Mars. What Parashara tells us is that if a planet in question is exalted in any of these signs, it is still friendly. So we're going to see in the example of Mars, where, Capricorn is ruled by Saturn. Capricorn is the 10th sign from Aries, which is Mars's Mulatrikona. That would typically mean it's an enemy, but Mars is exalted in Capricorn, which means Capricorn is not an unfriendly position to Aries and to Mars. I'm going to show a more visual example of that just to show what I mean, but just keep this rule in mind. If the planet in question is exalted, then it is still friendly to the Mulatrikona. Now, why is this? You'll find that the 2nd, 4th, 5th, 8th, 9th, and 12th are generally supportive of the agenda of the sign in question. And we recognize most of these. The 5th and the 9th are obvious because they are trines to the 1st house. And, the signs from another sign is a little bit different than the auspiciousness of the houses. To clarify here, this is just simply what it is that these positions are considered generally supportive of the agenda of the sign in question, of the point in question, even though the 8th and 12th houses are known to cause a bit of trouble. This is where the schema comes from generally, and this is one of those weird things in Vedic astrology. This particular formula is the basis of these relationships, and the 8th and the 12th in this rare case are considered to be conducive to the agenda of the sign, of the Mulatrikona sign. Now, this means that if a sign owns the 3rd, the 6th, the 7th, the 10th, or the 11th place from the Mulatrikona, it can get in the way of a planet's capacity to fulfill its innate nature. And we're going to see exactly, bear with me if this seems a bit confusing, because I'm going to show some visual examples to show exactly what I'm talking about. One thing I want to keep in mind is that all these enemy houses, the 3rd, the 6th, the 7th place, the 10th place, and the 11th place, these are all earth and air houses in the natural house system, in the natural zodiac, right? And that's with the exclusion of the 2nd house. The 2nd house has a funky neutrality. And the nature of the earth and air houses are different from the fire and water houses. The fire is obvious. The fire houses are the 1st house, the 5th house, and the 9th house. We can see why those are positive. They are of the nature of the rising sign. But so is the 4th, the 8th, and the 12th. And just keep in mind the earth and air theme, because we're going to see this come again later on in this lesson. Now, let's take a look at the friends and enemies defined from the Mulatrikona. Now, we've got the South Indian chart and the North Indian chart here. I typically use the South Indian chart. So in the South Indian chart, I'm using the example of Aries. This is the sign of Aries. So the 2nd house from Aries is considered, remember, the 2nd sign, I should say, from the Mulatrikona of Mars. Because right now, Aries, as we learned, Aries is the Mulatrikona of Mars, right? So what we're looking at is the rulership of signs in their house positions or their sign positions from this Mulatrikona point. And this is going to tell us which planets are friends and enemies to Mars. The 2nd position is considered friendly. The 3rd position is considered unfriendly. The 4th position is friendly. The 5th position is friendly. We can see that the 6th and 7th are not included in the friendly, so they're considered, the planets that own the 6th and 7th sign from the Mulatrikona are considered unfriendly. The 8th and the 9th are friendly, the 10th and the 11th are unfriendly, and then the 12th is friendly. It's amazing that we can see, again, just the nature of Mars. For it to have its friends, again, we can use symbolic inference and see, oh, it makes sense. But this is the mathematical formula of why it makes sense. So bear with me. This is just going to kind of make a little bit more sense. So since we're using Aries as our example, we can think about the number here as relating to the actual sign. 2 is Taurus, the 2nd sign of the zodiac. 3 is Gemini, the 3rd sign. Cancer is 4, the 4th sign of the zodiac. Now let's look at Mars's friends here. This is how we define friendships of all the planets. This is kind of like, I like to say, I'm just going to do a quick little caveat here and say that, when you go to chemistry school, you're going to be learning about all these different chemical relationships between all these chemicals. Now, you have to learn the whole periodic table in chemistry school, but when you might go into a plastic factory and only use a few of those chemicals. But you need to know all of the periodic table and learn about them in order to understand the specific chemicals and plastics you're dealing with. In the same way, people in chemistry school, they're like, God, I got to learn this whole periodic table, and I'm only going to use a little bit of it. This is kind of like that. This is why we're learning about the Mulatrikonas, is to know the background about why these planets have the relationships that they do. That's something I wanted to say at some point here. So let's look at the relationship of the Sun to Mars and its Mulatrikona, which is Aries, right? Aries is the root nature of Mars. Now, when we look at Leo, we know that the Sun only rules one sign, it's Leo. Leo is in the 5th position from Aries. It's in one of the trines. So we know that the 5th is a friendly the fifth sign from the Mulatrikona is friendly. That means that Leo is friendly to Mars. Since it doesn't rule another sign, we say, therefore, the Sun is a friend to Mars. Let's look at Cancer. Cancer is in the fourth position from Aries. 1, 2, right? So Aries is the first, Taurus is the second, Gemini is the third, Cancer is the fourth sign from Aries. Right? So Cancer, we know that the fourth sign from the Mulatrikona is friendly. Cancer doesn't rule any other signs, therefore the moon is a friend to Mars. Now let's look at Mercury. You can see that Mercury rules the third sign, which is unfriendly to the Mulatrikona. And Mercury also rules the sixth sign from Aries, which is Virgo. Virgo is the sixth sign from Aries, and the sixth sign is an unfriendly position to the Mulatrikona. So since Mercury rules the third and the sixth houses from Aries, Mercury is considered an enemy to Mars because Aries is the Mulatrikona. Now let's look at Jupiter. Jupiter is considered a friend to Mars. Why is that? Well, Sagittarius is the ninth sign from Aries, and Pisces is the 12th sign. We know that the ninth and the 12th are considered friendly positions from the Mulatrikona, right? So remember again that the 12th house isn't typically a good house, but when we're talking about defining the relationship of these signs to the Mulatrikona, this is the specific formula Parashara gives us. And it's, again, it's an exceptional sort of formula. So this is why we know that Jupiter rules the 9th and 12th signs from Aries as Mars is Mulatrikona. Therefore, Jupiter is a friend to Mars. Jupiter's nature is conducive to the agenda of Mars. So if Mars is in the sign of Sagittarius, or if Mars is in the sign of Pisces, it's in the sign of a natural friend. It's because these signs are in positions that are not antagonistic to Aries. Now, let's look at Venus. Venus is neutral to Mars. Why is that? Well, remember, the second sign from the Mulatrikona is considered a friendly position, but the seventh sign is not considered a friendly position. Venus rules a friendly sign from Aries, and Venus rules an unfriendly sign from Aries. Therefore, since Aries is Mars's Mulatrikona, we know that Venus owns a good one and a bad one, therefore it's neutral. So when Mars is in Taurus, as we originally asked, Mars is in neutral dignity. It's neither good nor bad. It takes the other factors in the chart to see how that dignity is going to play out. And now, finally, here's the important thing here for us to remember. This has that exaltation rule I was talking about. We know that, just to show us here, Aquarius is the 11th sign from Aries. We know that the 11th sign is not considered a friendly position from the Mulatrikona. So we know Aquarius has a negative connotation for Aries. And we would usually think that the 10th position is unfriendly. And it would almost seem that Saturn should be an enemy to Mars. But Mars is exalted in the sign of Capricorn. That was our special rule here. The lords of the signs, if the planet in question is exalted in any of these unfriendly signs, that sign position is still friendly. So that's why we see here for Mars in particular, Capricorn is where Mars is exalted. So therefore, Capricorn is neutral. Capricorn is a friendly position from Aries. Since Saturn rules a friendly and unfriendly house, just like Venus, Saturn is considered neutral to Mars. So for example, if we take the planet Mars and we put it in the sign of Aquarius, it's not considered ill dignity. Let me reiterate this. The dignity has to do, and I've got to say this way. Dignity has to do with the position of a planet in a friendly or unfriendly. Dignity has to do with the position of a planet in a sign that is ruled by a planet that is either friendly or unfriendly or neutral. So if we take Mars and we put it in the sign of Aquarius, it is neutral. It's not in any enemy dignity, because Saturn is not an enemy to Mars. Saturn is neutral to Mars. If Saturn has an aspect to Mars, it's not going to starve Mars, because starvation in the Logitati Avashtas only occurs when a planet's being aspected by an enemy. Saturn is not an enemy to Mars. So if you put Mars in Capricorn, it's exalted and it's going to have great dignity. But if you put Mars in the sign of Aquarius, it's not in bad dignity. It's considered neutral dignity because Saturn is in a neutral relationship with Mars. Hopefully that's not confusing, but you're going to see when we look at the planets and their friends and enemies, that's where we define dignity through. Again, we're just looking at the guts of why these planets have these relationships. So Mars's friends are the Moon, Sun, and Jupiter. Neutral to Mars is Venus and Saturn, and Mars's one enemy, the one planet which has two signs that are in negative positions from Aries, the Mulatrikona of Mars, is Mercury. If Mars is in the sign of Gemini or Virgo, then it will be considered to be an enemy dignity. Mars gets confused by Mercury. There's too much scattered mutability with Mercury. There's too much, it confuses and fogs the mind of Mars. Mars is supposed to act by its warrior instinct. And when Mars is conjunct Mercury or aspected by Mercury or in the sign of Virgo or Gemini, it has a hard time because Mercury is an enemy of Mars, the only enemy of Mars. Now, I'm using the North Indian chart here, and we're just going to do the same thing we did for Mars, and we're just looking at the Sun, just to give a little bit more understanding here. The sign of Cancer, the 12th house from the Sun, is friendly, so the Moon is a friend to the Sun. As for Mercury, Mercury rules the second house from Leo. Remember, so yeah, we're talking about the Sun, and Leo, as we know, is the Mulatrikona of the Sun. So we've got to look at the position of all these signs from Leo in order to see the Sun's relationships with other planets. Virgo rules the second sign from Leo, and that's considered friendly. But Gemini owns the 11th sign from Leo, and that's unfriendly. So Mercury is neutral to the Sun. Libra owns the 3rd house, which is an enemy, and it also owns the 10th house, which is an unfriendly sign. So therefore, Venus is an enemy to the Sun. Mars is a friend to the Sun. Mars owns the 4th house, and it also owns the 9th house. Jupiter is also a friend to the Sun. Jupiter owns the 5th house and the 8th house. Both of those are considered friendly positions from the Mulatrikona, Leo. And then finally, Saturn rules the 6th house from Leo and the 7th house from Leo. So therefore, Saturn is an enemy to the Sun. And that's what we're looking at here. This is why I said that the Sun, the king, does not like to be in the signs of Taurus or of Libra or of Capricorn or of Aquarius. In those cases, it's considered to be an enemy dignity, at least in its natural relationship. At this point, I'd like to say I should have made a slide for this, and I'm just thinking about it now. There's a difference between natural relationships and temporary relationships. The natural relationships are what we're talking about now. The Sun has those 3 friends, and then it has Mercury as neutral, and then it has Venus and Saturn as enemies. These are natural, permanent relationships. But there's also something called temporary relationships between the planets. Has to do with if a planet is in close proximity to each other. If Sun is in Taurus and another planet is in the 2nd or 3rd or 4th house, or the 12th, 11th, or 10th house around the Sun, that's considered temporal friendship. It's something you're going to learn about in our apprenticeship. I have to speak to it now because just because the Sun is in the sign of Capricorn doesn't mean that it's necessarily in enemy dignity. But right now we're just talking about the natural relationships between planets, where, for example, the Sun being aspected by Saturn, let's say if the Sun is opposite Saturn, that's always going to be a devastating thing for the Sun. The Sun is going to get starved by Saturn because the Sun and Saturn is an enemy to the Sun. Now, I'm just going to check that we're good here. Yes. Now, this is just us showing the friendships and enmity between all the planets. Notice that Sun, Moon, Mars, and Jupiter are always kind of grouped together. Mars, Jupiter, and the Moon are friends of the Sun. Mercury is neutral to the Sun because Gemini, as you know, we already saw why for the Sun. And then Saturn and Venus are considered to be enemies of the Sun. They own two signs that are antagonistic to Leo, the Sun's Mulatrikona, that's root nature. Now for the Moon has the Sun and Mercury for its friends. And this is an interesting thing because if you have the Moon and Mercury conjunct, you'll see that for Mercury, the Moon is an enemy. And this often happens with these planets. Is just like it is in human relationships. There are some planets where one planet's friendly to the other, while the other planet is an enemy. And this is really the best known one. Is the Moon is considered an enemy to Mercury, but Mercury is a friend to the Moon. If the Moon and Mercury are conjunct together, it's a good thing for the Moon because the emotions gains the intelligence of Mercury. But it's a bad thing for Mercury because the intelligence of Mercury is clouded by the emotions of the Moon. And this is why, right? Now, I do want to say, this is a common thing to say here, is that Jupiter is an enemy to nobody, to no planet. Every planet can get along well with Jupiter, or at least neutral to Jupiter. The Moon has no enemies and can adapt to any planet. So Jupiter is an enemy to nobody. The Moon has no enemies. The Moon can deal with the nature of any sign and of any conjunction except for Saturn. Well, you'll learn that when we get to the Logitati of Ashtas. Saturn starves everything that comes and touches it. It's an interesting thing here that, you know, what they say in Vedic mythos is that nobody is enemies with their own mother, their root, in a way. The Moon is the mother of all of our consciousness in a certain way. So it's interesting to note that Taurus is the Mulatrikona and the exaltation point of the Moon. And Taurus is a very earthy, adaptable position. You know, even Venus doesn't have Taurus for its Mulatrikona. Venus has Libra. It has a hopeful idea of what it wants. But the Moon has Taurus for its Mulatrikona. Shows that the Moon rules our ability to accept and adapt the life that we have on Earth. Earthy Taurus. It's a little bit of esoteric extra wisdom for you there. So neutral to the Moon is Mars, Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn. You know, if the Moon is in the sign of Sagittarius, it's in neutral dignity. If the Moon is in the sign of Capricorn or Aquarius, it's in neutral dignity. So for Mars, its friends are the Sun, the Moon, and Jupiter. Venus and Saturn are neutral to Mars, and then as we've seen, Mercury is the only enemy of Mars. For Mercury, its friends are the Sun and Venus. Mercury does well in the signs of Leo, the sign of Taurus, and the sign of Libra. Mercury is neutral or at least Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn are neutral to Mercury. That's how I should say it. And the moon is an enemy to Mercury. Mercury does not do well in the sign of Cancer. In this case, it's thirsted by the moon. It doesn't get enough. It has an emotional need that makes it unable to feel like it's getting its agenda done when it's in the sign of Cancer. And as we go along in our apprenticeship, you'll learn how to deal with these things as a counselor, right? Sun, Moon, and Mars are friendly to Jupiter. So if Jupiter falls in the sign of Leo, if Jupiter falls in the sign of Aries or Scorpio or Cancer, well, Cancer is the exaltation point. But if Jupiter falls in Leo, Aries, or Scorpio, it's in a friendly sign. Saturn is neutral to Jupiter, and Mercury and Venus are enemies of Jupiter. The sattvic nature of Jupiter is said to not do well in the rajasic arena of Mercury and Venus. There's an enjoyment of the surface of things when Jupiter is associated with these planets that stops it from doing the sacrifice towards Dharma that Jupiter is supposed to do. So Mercury and Venus are enemies of Jupiter. Now we'll notice, you're going to see that we're going to talk a lot about how Saturn, Venus, and Mercury are grouped together. Saturn and Mercury are friendly to Venus. Jupiter and Mars are neutral to Venus, and the Sun and Moon are enemies to Venus. And for Saturn, Venus and Mercury are friendly to Saturn. Jupiter is is neutral to Saturn, and the Sun, Mars, and Moon are all enemies of Saturn. You'll note that Saturn is, of course, the planet that has the most enemies and the most places where it could land and be in an uncomfortable position. Well, I guess I shouldn't say that because the Moon and Sun only rule one sign, but I digress. And you'll notice also, again, that there are these groupings. Saturn, Venus, and Mercury are typically grouped together. Now, this grouping is here, as we can see. The Sun, Moon, Mars, and Jupiter tend to be in the same grouping. They all get along together. Venus, Mercury, and Saturn tend to be in another grouping. What is the nature of this dichotomy? Well, this is how we could explain it, is that there are these two groupings. There's the sort of like the fire and water signs relates to the soul and to the nature of the sign in question. You know, we know that the fire signs and the trinal houses relate to the natural nature of the rising sign. But it's the same thing with the water signs, because the water signs are tied in with the fire signs. We know that Scorpio is shared with Aries in the rulership of Mars. We know that Jupiter rules Sagittarius and Pisces. It's fire and water, right? So there's a grouping of the fire and water planets, and there's a grouping of the air and earth planets who rule the air and earth signs. How I kind of put it, this is a language that will do for what we're trying to convey here. We can see that Sun, Moon, Mars, and Jupiter kind of convey the inner soul or spirit nature. And then Venus, Mercury, and Saturn are more about communication, about infrastructure, about being in a system in the material world. And we can see these groupings happening here. This is a very important diagram. I recommend you save it or make it yourself, recreate it in your own way so you can see the importance of it. Saturn rules Capricorn and Aquarius, earth and air. Mercury rules Virgo and Gemini, earth and air. Venus rules Taurus and Libra, earth and air, right? So they are grouped in this same sort of grouping. Cancer and Leo, water and fire. Scorpio and Aries, water and fire. It's ruled by Mars. Jupiter rules Pisces and Sagittarius, water and fire. This is where this nature of this dichotomy kind of comes from. This is what we use as an alchemy that gives the elastic snap that Jyotish astrology is known for talking about. Auspiciousness and inauspiciousness, as we've said. So we can see Jupiter, Mars, and the Sun all rule the fire signs, and then Jupiter, Mars, and the Moon all rule the water signs. That's why these guys all get along together. Saturn, Venus, and Mercury all rule the earth signs, and Saturn, Venus, and Mercury also all rule the air signs. And this is the nature of this grouping. Now, we note that the Mulatrikona, we've basically at this point, we've learned the guts of what the Mulatrikona is all about. Now, I want to give a little bit of extra information about how the Mulatrikona becomes useful later on. And this is just showing the importance of this Mulatrikona principle. The Mulatrikona comes into play later in more intermediate branches of Jyotish. And, you know, if you are young in your apprenticeship, or if you're just watching this on YouTube and you're just kind of checking things out, note that we are going to explain more of this. This is kind of intermediate, just know that. But I like to give these glimpses into the full infrastructure of what Jyotish is all about. So the Mulatrikona comes into play when we're considering the auspicious planetary lords for the Lagna, the rising sign. It's like what planets does a rising sign use naturally and constructively and in harmony? In particular, the Mulatrikona sign shows the stronger influence between two signs that a planet owns in a Lagna. And we're going to show some examples here just to give you some last bits of understanding. Remember to keep in mind that what we're about to see is really a more intermediate branch of Jyotish. And this shows which houses are conducive to auspicious results and which are not. Really, again, they're just small examples because auspicious planets to the Lagna, to the rising sign, is an intermediate thing. But let's take a peek here. Consider Scorpio rising. Scorpios are particularly known for having a sharp, penetrating, mechanical mind. Scorpios are often the ones enduring for a long time in the trenches and fixing other people's problems. So thus, they're often perceived as being malefic, intimidating, daunting, busy, confrontational people. Part of the reason for this is because the Lord of Scorpio rising is Mars, and the Mulatrikona of Mars is in the sign of Aries, which rules the malefic 6th house. So in the Scorpio rising chart, Mars rules the 1st house and the 6th house. But the 6th house is even louder than the 1st house. And this is why Scorpios have this sharp energy, because as we know, the 6th house is a house of difficulty in Jyotish. It is, well, of course, we always have to convey here that if the 6th house is well placed, and if Mars is well placed in a Scorpio's chart, they use this 6th house nature to deal with problems, and then there's no problem. This is what we have to understand, that this doesn't mean that all Scorpios are going to be bad, or that this is always going to turn out bad for a Scorpio. I've known many Scorpio risings in my life, and I can always lean on them to deal with issues that nobody else wants to deal with. This is part of the great, again, in astrology, this is another example where if you're given a hand in poker, it's not about how bad the cards are, it's about how you use them. And Scorpio rising has positive things that other charts, other rising signs don't have. So if you have a well-placed Mars, you are dealing with this issue. But this is how we want to think of it. The Mulatrikona of Mars is in the sign of Aries, which rules the malefic 6th house. So the pushy enemies theme of the 6th house is emphasized for Scorpio. The Mulatrikona emphasizes Aries over Scorpio. And so they have more of an idea, they their brains are more geared towards dealing with problems, even than dealing with their own important things in life. Now, Aries is different. Aries is different because the first house holds the Mulatrikona. Do you see what I'm getting at here? For Aries rising, it's a different situation. Now, typically, the 8th house from the rising sign, that's Scorpio in this case. Aries is the rising sign. Scorpio is the 8th house from the rising sign. Now, the 8th house from the rising sign, the Lagna, is considered by Parashara to be an unstable house. And since Mars rules the 1st house and the 8th house, Mars shares its identity of the 1st house, the physical body and the personality, with this unstable 8th house. And so Aries does take on some unstable energy in its expression. This is why the ancient Vedic nickname for Mars is the crooked one. It's because Mars always either rules the 6th house from itself or the 8th house from itself in the lordship of the rising sign. So for an Aries rising, Aries can take on a crooked path. The Scorpio ruling the 8th house isn't as strong an influence, though. And it doesn't knock the Aries off course, because the main rulership is Aries as the Mulatrikona in the 1st house. Aries tends to be more stable than Scorpio rising for this reason. But it's like, more chance can lead to more gains. It's really, even if you're a Scorpio rising, if you have a very well-placed Mars, it's going to save a lot of trouble. There's an opportunity to have trouble, but if Mars is well-placed, it's actually even better for Scorpio rising than it is for Aries rising, because Aries rising is more balanced. If you have a good Mars, it's an important thing for Aries because it's the first lord, but it's more important to have a good Mars for Scorpio rising. We can see why. Basically, Scorpio rising has more capacity to be dragged asunder by an ill Mars. Now, for Aries rising, the 1st house is the more important. The 1st house is more emphasized because Aries is the Mulatrikona and it rules the 1st house. Now, remember, Scorpio and, well, I should say Aries is still considered the crooked. But the thing is that it doesn't ruin Aries in this way, or at least it's not as debilitating for an Aries as it is for Scorpio. Identity and a stable life path, the 1st house, is instinctively more important to Aries rising than the opportunism of the 8th house is, because the 1st house is the Mulatrikona. So while Aries does assume a crooked path, because the Lagna Lord is combined with the 8th Lord, Mars rules the 1st house and the 8th house. But many people see the snake-like path of Aries from the outside. They can wander and go into they'll go into big missions and they'll take on big projects. But Aries only sees the goal, which lies firmly ahead. And Aries won't take on a mission that will completely ruin its long goal. It has its own agenda in mind, right? A long-standing agenda, and the 8th house nature of Mars doesn't knock it off course. And that is the end of our session for today, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you so much for watching. Feel free to visit me at How to Rock Astrology for more of my own videos. And again, if you enjoyed what you saw in this video today, feel free to check out the link below in the description to see how you can become an apprentice in the Asheville Vedic Astrology apprenticeship program. And you can get the credentials and you can be a part of our community. It's a growing community that's dedicated to learning the real guts of what is given by the sages in understanding the logic behind Vedic astrology and Vedic Jyotish. Thanks so much for watching, folks, and I hope you guys enjoyed this. I'll see you again.